Her hand moved the napkin across the table in the way of someone who has rehearsed the motion many times in their mind before doing it. Not fast, not panicked. A slow, deliberate slide, flat palm on paper, pushing it across the laminate tabletop in the direction of the man at the counter, then withdrawing. The motion lasted 3 seconds. The man at the counter had his back to her. She had timed it for the moment when the man across from her went to the bathroom. The napkin stopped at the edge of the counter stool, to Mac Callahan's right. He looked at it. A paper napkin, folded once. He picked it up. He unfolded it. One word in block letters pressed hard with a ballpoint pen. Help. He did not look up. He did not look toward the booth where the girl was sitting. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, found his pen, unfolded another napkin from the dispenser in front of him, and began to write. He had not seen the man across the table from her yet. He did not know how long she had been in this diner or where she had come from or what she had been through. He knew. One word pressed hard in block letters on a paper napkin. He knew the particular quality of its handwriting. Controlled, not frantic, the writing of someone who had waited for precisely the right moment before doing this. He knew that someone had chosen him, specifically, from everyone in this room. That was enough to start. Mac Callahan was 49 years old, and he had been riding since he was 22, and the roads between his chapter in Portland and wherever the road ended on any given year had produced a man who was not easily surprised by what life placed in front of him. He was broad and gray-bearded and deliberate, the kind of man who filled a doorway without requiring anyone to acknowledge it, and he had been eating a dinner of pot roast and coffee at the counter of the Millhaven Grill in Ashford, Tennessee, because Ashford was where the rain had caught him on the way to Phoenix, and the Millhaven Grill was the first light he'd seen off the highway. He was heading to a memorial service, a chapter brother named Terry Cross who had died in October, a good man, a man worth a 5-day ride in November to honor. Mac had left Portland on a Wednesday, and he was in no particular hurry, and he had given himself the long route through the interior of the country because the long route was where he did his thinking, which was the same reason he had been riding the long route for 27 years. He had a daughter named Renee who was 23 and lived in Seattle and called him on Sunday evenings, and had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a quality of careful observation that Mac had always believed was partly his and partly something she had built herself in the year she was 12. That was the year she had a surgery on her vocal cords, a benign growth, caught early, removed cleanly, and had woken from it without her voice. The surgeon said 3 months. It had been 11 months before her voice came back fully, and in those 11 months Mac had learned American Sign Language with her, working through a workbook at the kitchen table every evening. Awkward at first and then less awkward, his hands finding the shape slowly and then with more confidence. He had done it because Renee needed it, and because her mother was less patient with the manual work, and because sitting at the kitchen table learning her language felt like the one correct thing he could do in an otherwise frightening year. Renee's voice came back. They still signed sometimes across rooms at family dinners. Small things, private things, the language that had outlived its necessity and become something else. He had kept all of it. He did not think of this when he picked up the napkin. He did not think of Renee or the kitchen table or the 11 months. He thought only of the word on the paper and the direction it had come from and what he needed to do next. He wrote on his napkin. He folded it. He waited. Before we find out what Mac wrote, hit subscribe and drop your location in the comments right now. City and state, anywhere in the world. I want to know how far this story travels. I read every single comment. Now, back to the Millhaven Grill in Ashford, Tennessee, on a wet November evening, because a girl named Sophie Barker had been building up to that napkin for 20 minutes, and the reason she slid it to this specific man and not to anyone else in the room matters. Sophie Barker was 17 years old, and she had been deaf since birth, and she had spent 17 years developing the specific capacities that the hearing world assumed she lacked, and which were in fact more refined than most hearing people would ever need. She read lips with an accuracy that still surprised her teachers. She read body language and micro-expression with a fluency that had no formal name. She read rooms the way other people read pages, quickly, with comprehension, retaining what mattered. She had been reading the Millhaven Grill for the 20 minutes she had been sitting in the back booth across from Curtis Lane, and she had arrived at conclusions. She carried a small notebook everywhere. She had carried one since she was 4 years old, and her mother gave her a blank composition book and a box of colored pencils and said, "Put the world in here." She had filled 43 notebooks since then. The current one was brown cardboard cover, half full, and she carried it in the outer pocket of her jacket where it sat against her left hip like a hand. When she finished a drawing, she folded the corner of the page inward, a private mark invisible from the outside that meant, "This one is done." She had been drawing in the booth while she waited, because not drawing would have told Curtis something was wrong. And Sophie had learned over 8 months of living with Curtis Lane that the greatest protection available to her was appearing to feel exactly as unremarkable as he wanted her to feel. She had been watching Mac Callahan for 20 minutes. She had watched the way he ate, present, without his phone, paying quiet attention to the room in the way of someone who is genuinely in the place they are rather than somewhere else in their mind. She had watched the patch on the back of his vest and understood that it meant something organized and committed, though she didn't know the specifics. She had watched his hands and his face and the set of his shoulders, and she had done the calculation that she had been running since she was old enough to understand that she was running it. This person or not this person, now or not now. How much does it cost to be wrong? She had decided on Mac Callahan. The notebook was her cover. She tore a napkin from the dispenser on the table with her left hand, while her right continued a line in the notebook, the way you do two things at once when one of them needs to be invisible. She wrote the word with her pen against her thigh, under the table, feeling the letters by pressure rather than sight. Curtis had been in the bathroom for 40 seconds. She pushed the napkin. She went back to her notebook. Curtis Lane was 39 years old, and he had been with Sophie's mother, Diane Barker, for 8 months, and the 8 months had been a process of careful installation. Small adjustments made one at a time, each one reasonable in isolation, each one pointing the same direction. He had changed Sophie's phone passcode in September for her safety because there were people who targeted deaf teenagers online, and he wanted to make sure she was protected. He had begun answering for Sophie in public in October, speaking on her behalf before she could reach for her notebook or her phone to type a response, because it was faster and people didn't always know how to wait. He had told Diane in November that Sophie had been struggling at school, a summary of a conversation between him and Sophie's guidance counselor that had happened differently than he described it. He was not violent. This was the thing that made him difficult to name and therefore difficult to stop. He did not strike or shout. He managed. He was the kind of man who had learned early that control exercised as care was invisible from the outside and very difficult to dispute from the inside. He had told Sophie and Diane tonight that he was taking Sophie to visit his sister in Knoxville for the week. Sophie had read his lips when he told Diane. She had watched Diane nod. She had watched Diane pack Sophie's bag and set it by the door and hug her and tell her to have fun. And Sophie had hugged her mother back and thought, she doesn't know. She doesn't know because he has built this so carefully that it doesn't look like what it is. Sophie had been in the diner for 90 minutes. The plan to Knoxville was his explanation for this stop. They needed dinner before the drive. She had stretched dinner as long as she could, eating slowly, drawing in the notebook, watching the room. She had arrived at Mac Callahan. Curtis came back from the bathroom and sat down and picked up his phone and looked at it, and Sophie closed the notebook and looked at the window. And neither of them looked at the man at the counter who was writing something on a paper napkin and folding it once. Mac waited until Curtis's eyes were on his phone. He placed the folded napkin on the counter to his right, on the edge closest to the booth, with his elbow resting next to it casually, as if it were part of the ordinary geography of his meal. He looked at his pot roast. He took a bite. He kept his face on his plate. Sophie saw the napkin from her peripheral vision. She watched Curtis's phone. She reached for the sugar dispenser on the table beside their booth, a normal thing, a reaching motion, and as her hand came back, she brought the napkin with it, tucked against the heel of her palm. She unfolded it under the table. I read you. Don't look at me. Is he armed? She tore a corner from the napkin. She wrote 2 letters. No. She pushed it back. They went like this, corner by corner, strip by strip, for 11 minutes while Curtis Lane scrolled his phone and the diner moved around them in its ordinary Tuesday evening register. The strips became a grammar, questions in Mac's handwriting, answers in Sophie's. He asked, "Do you want to leave right now?" She wrote, "He'll notice. I need to wait." He wrote, "I'm going to move closer. Don't react." She wrote, "Okay." He asked the server for a coffee refill and moved, in the natural way of a man looking for a quieter spot, to the counter stool at the end of the counter nearest the back booth. He was 6 feet from Sophie now, his back still angled away, and when Curtis looked up from his phone, he saw only a man at the counter eating his dinner. When Curtis looked back down, Mac raised his left hand to his collar, apparently adjusting his jacket, and signed 2 words, "SAF, wait." Sophie had been in ASL since she was 3 years old. She read the signs the way she read everything, completely, instantly. She looked at the window, she breathed. Matt turned to the server and said something brief and quiet. The server looked at him. She nodded once and went to the host station and picked up the phone. He had asked her to call 911 20 seconds ago when he leaned past her for the coffee. Curtis decided to leave at 8:47 p.m. Sophie read the decision in his body before he said it. The way he straightened, put down his phone, looked at her with the expression that meant, "We're done here." He spoke to her, and she watched his lips. Time to go. He put money on the table. He stood. He put his hand on the strap of her bag. Sophie looked at Mac. She did not plan to. It was involuntary, the eyes going to the one person in the room she trusted in the specific way of a person in danger who has one anchor. Mac set down his fork. He stood slowly to his full height, and the counter stool made a sound that was small but sufficient. He walked toward the door, not toward Curtis, toward the door, and he stopped in the doorway with his hand on the frame and said without turning, in a voice that was the same level it always was, "Chilly out there." He did not move away from the door. Curtis looked at him. "Excuse me," he said. "Sure," Max said. He took out his phone. He made a call, standing in the doorway, without moving aside, without looking at Curtis. "Hey," he said into the phone. "I'm at the Millhaven Grill in Ashford." "Mm-hmm." He listened. "I'll be a few more minutes." He kept the phone to his ear. He looked at the parking lot. Curtis stood in the aisle of the diner with his hand on Sophie's bag and looked at the man in the doorway and made the calculation that this situation called for, which took him 4 seconds longer than he wanted it to, because the man in the doorway had a cut on, and the cut had a patch on it. And the patch was not from any local chapter that Curtis had any previous experience with, which meant the geography of the situation was not as legible as he needed it to be. The sound of a siren, still several blocks away, reached the diner through the closed door. Mac did not react to it. He kept the phone to his ear. Curtis's hand came off Sophie's bag. The police arrived in 4 minutes. They came because a server named Lee had called from the host station at the request of a man at the counter who had said very quietly, "There's a minor in the back booth with a man she's afraid of, and she's deaf, and she can't call for help herself, and I need you to send someone now." There were 2 officers. They spoke with Curtis Lane in the parking lot. They spoke with Sophie inside, with a deputy who knew basic ASL, a fact that made Sophie's eyes go wide briefly, in the specific way of someone who has been prepared for obstacles and encountered none. She told them what she needed to tell them. She showed them the strips of napkin. Curtis Lane was detained pending further inquiry into the circumstances of the trip to Knoxville and several related matters that the investigation would clarify over the following weeks. Sophie sat in a booth with Mac and a female officer and drank the hot chocolate that Leigh brought her, and when the officer stepped away briefly, Sophie opened her notebook. She wrote in it and turned it toward Mac. "How did you know ASL?" He looked at the question. He thought about how to answer. He picked up the pen from her notebook and wrote, "My daughter." He paused. He added, "She's okay now." Sophie read this. She looked at him. She signed with her right hand a single thing, the sign she had learned from her mother when she was 3, the first sign she ever learned, the one that needed no translation. Mac made it back. Engines. They came down Sophie Street at 7:52 the following morning. Not to a diner, not to a confrontation, not to a villain who needed to understand what he had miscalculated. They came to a small house on Crestwood Drive in Ashford, Tennessee, where Sophie Barker and her mother Diane had spent the night with a victim's advocate and a family counselor, because the advocate and the counselor had determined that returning home was appropriate and safe, and because that was Sophie's house and Sophie had a right to be in it. Mac had made one call from the parking lot of the Mill Haven Grill at 9:11 p.m. He had talked to his road captain, Gus Farrell, who was in Portland and answered on the second ring, and he had said a girl's name and a street address. And one more thing, which was, by morning, whatever you can get, 150 motorcycles. They came from the chapter and from the surrounding chapters and from people who had received a phone call or a text in the night and who had put on their cuts and gotten on their bikes and driven through the dark. They turned onto Crestwood Drive at 7:52 a.m. in a line that moved slowly and without theater, and they parked along the curb and in front of the house and down the block in both directions. And when the last engine went silent, the street was absolutely still. Gus Farrell was the first off his bike. He was 53, built like someone who had spent 30 years making sure the right things got to the right places. And he walked to where Mac was standing on the sidewalk outside Sophie's house. He looked at the house. "She inside?" he said. The curtain in the front window moved. A face appeared, briefly, then gone. 1 minute later, the front door opened, and Sophie Barker came onto the porch. She had her jacket on. She had her notebook in her hand. She stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at the street and looked at 150 motorcycles and 150 people looking back at her. And the morning light was cold and clear, and the street was completely, totally silent. She looked at Mac on the sidewalk. She signed something. Her hands were quick and certain. Mac read it. He turned to Gus and said, "She says thank you." Gus looked at the girl on the porch for a moment. He had a daughter himself, 26, a nurse in Tacoma. He looked at the girl on the porch in a way that took a moment to complete. "Tell her she's welcome," he said. Mac raised his hand and made the sign she had taught him the night before, the first sign she'd ever learned, the sign her mother had given her when she was 3 years old. Sophie watched his hands. A sound came from her, the particular sound that deaf voices make when something is felt deeply enough to become audible, involuntary. Not a word, but its own kind of language. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Diane appeared behind her in the doorway, and Diane looked at the street and then at her daughter and began to understand, in the specific and terrible way of a person who has been deceived carefully and for a long time, the dimensions of what she had not seen. Curtis Lane was charged and remanded to custody pending hearing. The investigation that followed reviewed 8 months of communications and financial records and located 2 prior incidents in a previous county that had been reported but not fully documented. Diane Barker sat with a counselor for many hours over the weeks that followed, and the conversations were difficult. And she had them all. A woman at Sophie's school named Miss Reeves, who was the ASL interpreter and who had been concerned about Sophie for 6 weeks but hadn't had enough to act on, filed the formal school report the day after the arrest. She had been waiting for the thing that would make the picture clear. Now she had it. Mac reached Phoenix on Saturday. He was 3 days late to the memorial service, and the people there who had expected him understood when he explained why, and the ones who did not know him well understood too, and nobody said it was anything other than correct. He called Renee from Phoenix. She answered on the second ring. He told her the part about the napkin and the part about the ASL, and she was quiet for a moment on the other end. And then she said, "Dad," just that. The way you say a word when you want someone to know you, hear them completely. He said, "I know." Sophie filled 3 pages of her notebook the morning after. She drew the motorcycles first. She had never drawn one before, and she drew them the way you draw something you were trying to understand, outline by outline, working out the shape of a thing by rendering it. She drew them in rows. She drew them filling the street. She drew Crestwood Drive in the early morning light, the houses with their dormant November gardens, the curb with its 150 motorcycles parked end to end in both directions, and the silence of it, the specific silence that exists when 150 engines have stopped and 150 people are present, and not one of them is speaking. She drew it until she understood it. Then she folded the corner of the page inward, invisibly, in the way only she would know. This one is done. Some people communicate by raising their voices. Some people communicate in other ways. And sometimes, if you are paying attention, if you are present in the place you are, if you learned a language once out of love and never forgot it, a single folded napkin with one word on it is the loudest thing in the room. If this story reached you tonight, Share it with someone who needs to remember that asking for help is the bravest thing a person can do. Hit subscribe and type Sophie in the comments. I'll read every one.